Hey, hi everyone. My name is Jessica Gonzalez-Rojas. I am a candidate for New York State Assembly in the 34th Assembly District, which includes the neighborhoods of Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, Corona, and Woodside. And I'm really excited tonight to have this panel to talk about housing as a racial justice issue, because we know in this moment that racial justice impacts all parts of our lives. And obviously what's at the forefront is the violence, the police brutality and the violence against our Black community. But we also see racial injustices happening in the healthcare system, in the housing system and education. And we need to ensure that we have a critical lens on these issues to ensure that we're advocating and fighting for policies that in which everyone can thrive. So I'm super, super excited to have an amazing panel today. So I'll start with just a quick logistics. We have everyone's cameras off for now and everyone muted, but we really, really do want your questions. We are on Zoom and we're on Facebook Live. So if you do have a question, please either chat it in on Facebook. We'll keep an eye on the Facebook comments as well. So we'll be able to answer those questions. I'll play the role of Oprah and be asking those questions. I also want to share some of the work that we've been doing as a campaign. We were a campaign that was really committed to advancing a people-powered grassroots agenda, and one in which we were knocking on doors and bringing the voices of our community front and center. And then coronavirus hit. So we immediately shifted to from knocking on doors to doing phone banks. And we focused on mutual aid, checking in on our seniors, on our neighbors to make sure they're okay, and delivering food, toilet paper, medicines, anything that they need in this moment. But most importantly, we were looking to connect them to more sustainable services, because while I believe, I'm humbled to be in service and help families that are in need, I believe that we really need sustainable solutions in which our communities are not falling through the cracks, particularly those who are most vulnerable, like our immigrant populations that are excluded from all forms of relief. And I'm fighting for a recovery for all. So we moved from knocking on doors to then getting on the phone. And we shifted from what would have been a plethora of town halls on different issues that I care about and different policy platforms that I'm presenting. And instead, here we are at a virtual town hall. So again, thank you for being part of this tonight. I'm really grateful to have two amazing organizers and activists with us today to engage in our conversation about housing as a racial justice issue in this moment. So again, if you have questions, please type that in the Facebook, or if you're on our Zoom, please type that in that chat, and we'll be able to elevate those questions during the conversation. I'll have folks really introduce themselves, but Divya is with she's here on her own accord as an activist, but in her daytime works at Community Voices Heard and is an incredible activist and organizer and fighter for racial and housing justice, as well as Sia Weaver, who's also here in her personal capacity as an organizer, but oversees the Housing Justice for All Coalition and does really amazing work working with activists and organizations across the city and state to fight for a bold housing agenda. I think you both spend a lot of time in Albany fighting for the issues that are really important. And, our session has been interrupted by coronavirus, but there's a lot to still fight for. So I'm super excited to have you both on. So I'll just really kick off with a question. Divya, I want to start with you. So if you could start by just sharing why housing is a racial justice issue, if you can connect it to sort of, how both criminal justice impacts someone's ability to access housing, right? Like the ways in which, NYCHA denies access for people who are formerly incarcerated, and how those issues often impact someone's ability to live in dignified housing. So just share your reflections and your analysis as housing justice as one in which is a racial justice issue.
Yeah, totally. I will start off, and I'm sure Sia can fill in. I think this is something that we've been meditating on a lot this week, just given everything that's happening in this country right now. We've seen these massive protests in response to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many other Black folks. And we've really been seeing like this massive outpouring of activism around like police brutality, right? And a lot of that is connected to just how we police private property, how that is something that is like the protection of property is so valued in our society and our legal system. Just it goes to like the very core of this country. And so then we can't forget that who used to be considered property, right? Black and brown people. So you can't really talk about housing without acknowledging the extremely racist roots of our country, of our housing market, our housing system. So I think that's something that's really important to sit with. Just racial capitalism is influencing the way we do the work. How that's impacted housing, right, is, you know, from these structural points, right? One of which you mentioned, formerly incarcerated folks can't access certain forms of housing, can't access public housing. You look at the practice of redlining, you look at gentrification. Yeah, I think just from that's kind of like from the broad perspective, like why we always have to think about housing from a racial lens. And I'll turn it over to Sia, who can just get more into like the nitty gritty details, I think.
Sure. Thanks, Divya. And thank you, Jessica, for having us. And I'm really excited about your campaign. And I'm just really excited for insurgent candidates who are willing to speak truth to power in the state assembly. Like, I'm just like, I know that it's a hard time to be campaigning, but I just want to say I'm like really excited about the work you're doing and thankful for the work you're putting in this moment.
I have you all in my office. Right? I'm excited about that.
Me too. So I think one of the things that Divya touched on that is really important to underscore is that for centuries, the country has pushed for public policy that prioritizes homeowners and property owners and those who like control the land over those who maybe live on it. And that means a lot of things. That means like, you know, bankers and mortgage holders have more say over what happens in your home than you if you're the homeowner. But it also means that if you're the landlord, you get to say or not say what happens in somebody's home if you're a renter. And so whether you are a homeowner who rents from a bank, like a bank tenant, because your mortgage is just so overwhelming and your housing costs are so high, or you're a renter who doesn't have any basic rights because our country doesn't afford renters basic rights. Our country and our democracy serves people who control property and not people who just want to live somewhere safe and somewhere that's affordable and somewhere who wants to take care of their family, you know. And so the way that you see that most, and that shows up racially too. Like, if you take property ownership and property wealth out of the equation, the racial wealth gap shrinks tremendously. The reality is that for years, our government, for centuries even, our government has facilitated stealing wealth from communities of color or putting the thumb on the scale so that white families can build generational wealth and Black families cannot. And that is that characterizes our housing policy, right? So Black families get some prime mortgages and white families get the GI Bill. White families get to become like low-cost homeowners and Black families are stuck in high-cost rental housing where they cannot build up equity, where landlords are exploiting them every single day, every single minute. And so the struggle for housing justice is really about struggling for dignity in our homes and about like collective and community control over land. It's about housing as a right, not housing as a way for individual people to profit. Because we know after centuries of living in this country, we know that if this is about profit, white people are going to be the ones who benefit. And if it's about people, we can actually fight for racial justice.
Yes, I love that. Talk about what the housing movement looks like in this moment, and how how is cross-cultural, cross-movement work happening? Because as you both were very clear, like housing is a racial justice movement, but how is the coalitions that are fighting for housing justice reflective of the racial justice movements that are happening? Can you talk more about the coalitions?
Yeah, I can start. So we can talk a little bit about Housing Justice for All, right? So that's over 70 organizations from across New York State, right? Like a lot of us are in New York City, but like we do a lot of work to just build this cross-state coalition, and I think that speaks to some of the diversity, right? In terms of race, in terms of what types of housing conditions we're organizing in, right? But then like even within like all the different groups of our coalition, there's so much diversity, and we've really tried to like push language justice to the forefront to act like open the movement to more people, right? I think CAV has done a really great job of that. A lot of like our Queens groups have done so much work to like bring language justice into the housing movement. And so that's culminated in like our movement just growing exponentially. So back in January, when we were actually able to like hit the ground and like go cause some good trouble up in Albany, right? We had organized this big lobby day. This is going to be like the kickoff of our campaign, and just introducing like our campaign strategy to Albany and like getting ready to like win some stuff, hopefully. And so we had buses from across the state, and we actually had our first ever Staten Island bus, which was wild. And what was so unique about that bus was that there were people from across 5 languages on that bus. We had people speaking English, Chinese, Spanish, Korean, and Russian, right? So we've really tried to do a lot of work to just bring more people into the movement.
Divya is like being very modest. Divya is the person who volunteered to get up in the morning to like land in Staten Island to make sure that the Staten Island bus was in Albany by 10 a.m., which is not easy to do.
It was a beautiful bus. I loved that experience. I made so many Staten Island friends.
I love it. I love it.
One day we will see them again in person.
And like our universal like signal, the thing that they all left the day with was like, if you get lost, meet at McDonald's. Like meet at the McDonald's building. And they just kept saying McDonald's to me, and that's like how we knew we were gonna be okay.
Right. That's a thing you need to bring to Albany. The Albany Lobby Days, McDonald's is a rendezvous. I mean, I think it's really important. So the housing movement is like super multiracial. It's super multi-generational. In addition to the 5 languages in which we're trying to run meetings, in addition to the fact that we are fighting for really universal programs. And the reason why we do that is because we cannot and will not leave our undocumented neighbors behind. In addition to the fact that we are constantly lifting up like the leadership of Black folks who have been locked out of housing for so long. We also have like youth, right? And so we have like from CVH to Churches United for Fair Housing to upstate member groups, like we have like a cadre of youth organizers who I think are pushing us to be like a lot more radical in how we're thinking about the housing movement. Because the reality is for like, maybe the generation above us, homeownership was an option. But for the generation, I see Caitlin on the phone, for the Caitlin's generation, right? Like the reality is folks are graduating with massive student loan debt, massive medical debt. Homeownership is increasingly out of reach for everybody. And so there is this like multiracial, youth-led, multi-generational housing movement that's saying we need renters' rights and we need our public policy to catch up to our new economic reality. And that's being led by Black folks, that's being led by young people, and it's really tremendous to watch, and it's transforming politics in our state.
And I'll just share like a quick story from the CVH youth group, which I facilitate, which is like almost entirely young people of color, which is just so energizing for me. And like, they're definitely way smarter than I was when I was their age. So, the future is bright.
I feel the same.
But it's been really crazy. We've been trying to meet weekly during quarantine to just like keep training, keep going, keep thinking about how we amplify youth voices in the housing movement. And we're also just having like more personal conversations of like what people are going through right now, right? And it's not just that like youth housing's future is being impacted, it's also like impacting their reality right now. So I'm like hearing from youth who their parents are non-essential workers and they've lost their jobs and they've lost income, and so now like families are relying on their internships, like their children's internships to pay the rent, right? And now like some of those internships are under threat. The summer youth engagement program has been canceled here in New York City. So, you know, they're thinking about like, yeah, my name isn't on the lease, but like I'm still impacted by my rent. I'm still dealing with like the reality of like remote learning right now. I don't have like a space separate from like my 3 or 4 siblings to like do school. So it's definitely come to the forefront. Like if you, I think all of us working from home right now, it's really becoming clear that like working from home is not a reality if you don't have a safe, comfortable home, and like learning from home is not a reality either. So that's, you know, where the youth have really been thinking about that.
Yeah, and one last thing, and then we should sort of move on. I mean, I'm sure we can move on, but like, I just think there's a couple things to name here. One is that so the housing movement has always been led by Black women, just always. And so that's just something to name. And then the reality is that 1 in 5 Black women are evicted in their lifetimes. This is like a tremendously, the housing crisis falls on the shoulders of Black women, and that's why Black women are leading the fight against it. But the thing that we also need to say when we say that is that the impacts that that has on our education system. Our education system is bearing the brunt of the housing crisis. 1 in 10 students in New York City's public school system are homeless. And there is just an increasing body of evidence about the lasting trauma that homelessness and eviction causes our young people. So if you're evicted in middle school, that is going to create post-traumatic stress for you and for your like ability to thrive for the rest of your life. It's going to create impacts on your health, impacts on your ability to work and to learn and to grow. And so it's really important to say that like we cannot invest. I mean, we should absolutely invest tomorrow in our public education system. But if we're not also investing in ending evictions for our renter families and for our women of color who are leading our housing movement, that investment is just going to be like throwing money at a problem that needs to be solved by stabilizing our households. And if we can't be evicting our 10-year-olds. Like our 10-year-olds cannot be homeless, but right now they are. And you can't go through middle school homeless. It's going to destroy your ability to like, frankly, even like socialize and make friends, right? And that like is going to last for the rest of your life. And so this trauma of eviction is creating generational trauma. So we have to address housing and education for our young people at the same time.
One quote that inspires all my work is from Audre Lorde. And she says, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. And you both nailed that, right? Without, like, housing is such a fundamental human right to have a place to rest, to live, to eat, to raise a family. And to be robbed of that is just so undignified, right? Like it's a moral failure of our government. And as you mentioned, it impacts so many other parts of your life, right? If you don't have a home, how do you get a job? If you don't have a home, how do you learn? And Divya, when you said, working from home is something that is not feasible for everybody because not everyone has a home. So tell me, what are the solutions that advocates are fighting for around homelessness in particular? And then we'll get in more into like some of the housing and rent fights that we have. But I'm just really struck about how many children are homeless and how many adults are homeless. I mean, it's a moral failure that we have people who don't have a place to go every night. And it's a tragic a tragic problem that needs to be solved, and it needs to be solved in a way that's not a Band-Aid, but actually a systemic solution. So I'd love to hear how you all are approaching it and what are the solutions you're fighting for.
Yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking that we are approaching a different phase in the coronavirus crisis, and de Blasio hasn't done anything to rehouse people who are living shoulder to shoulder in shelter or in the streets in our city's empty hotels. Like, literally, it's that easy.
Prisons, right?
Or prisons, right? Like the sort of, we have to stop criminalizing our homeless neighbors. We have to just do harm reduction and get people into the hotels that are sitting empty. And so that's like the number one thing that we urgently need, like yesterday. Not yesterday, 3 weeks ago, 10 weeks ago. And that's just like a symbol, right? That's a symbol of this broader problem that we have tons and tons and tons of vacant luxury homes that are being used as tax shelters, and then tons and tons and tons of people who don't have homes. So we need to find public policy that matches those things. And an urgent intervention is support to help people pay the rent. People who currently cannot afford their rent need help paying their rent. And that needs to come with like strong control so that landlords can't exploit that money and take that money and not give people homes, right? We have a long history of source of income discrimination or discrimination against people who meet any number of characteristics that our homeless brothers and sisters like meet, right? So this like racial discrimination, source of income discrimination needs to be like eradicated from our system. And we also need to give people money to help pay the rent. And then we also need to use that money to build to a more sustainable world where we're actually like building housing and like running housing, not for profit, but for people. So like sort of in terms of like urgency to solve the homelessness crisis, we need to get people out of urgently unsafe situations. We need to help people pay their rent. And then we need to like invest in social and supportive services so that we never end up in this situation ever again.
Divya, do you want to add to that? Or is that kind of encompassing like a lot of the asks that a lot of the advocates are making?
Yeah, I think Sia covered it really well. I guess like I could just add a little bit about public housing right now. So public housing residents in New York City, in NYCHA, are eligible to like negotiate rent decreases if they can demonstrate loss of income, right? And like that is supposed to be a mechanism to like avoid evictions, of like give people support in a time of crisis like this one, keep people in their homes, right? That's not happening. People are calling the number, calling management, trying to negotiate like a change in their rent, and they're not getting through to anyone. CVH actually did an action today where we organized public housing tenants across the city to just call the number and see if they can get their rent reduced. And not a lot of people got through, and people were being like hung up on, right? So I think we also just need to think about like implementation of a lot of these policies and how are we actually making sure that these things are actually accessible to folks. And I think, if we do have this vision for long-term social housing, right? Like we also need to invest in the social and public housing we have now and really prove that it can work if we give it the resources that it deserves, that people deserve.
Absolutely. So let's reflect on 2018 when there was a wave of insurgents who were able to take out moderate Democrats and members of the IDC, which is the Independent Democratic Caucus, which were a slate of senators who caucus with Republicans and really held up good work. So those folks were out. We have bold new leaders in. Tell us about the victories from that session last year. And well, let's start there. Let's talk about what changed in that moment, and what did progressive electeds what were they able to accomplish alongside the work of housing justice advocates?
Yeah, so I love that when you frame this question, you start with 2018, because I think that the lessons of 2019 have to do with how the candidates ran their elections. And I see that in how you're running your election too. You're running people are running people-powered campaigns that are refusing to work with the real estate industry and that are working with grassroots community leaders to like say like, I am running on these values and I intend to be accountable to these values if I win. And so what happened in 2018 is like, I think it doesn't hurt that the person in the White House is ultimately a New York City real estate developer. So I think it's always important to say like where that person came from and who he is and like, you know, how he got his money, and it's from exploiting renters. So we had a slate of candidates who ran against real estate's influence in politics. And I think that's important to name because, you know, they got to Albany and we all worked together to hold them accountable once they got there to pass tremendous and transformative tenants' rights. But they didn't do everything. They didn't eliminate solitary confinement or legalize marijuana. And so I think it's very important that as organizers, we think about how we run elections and how the issues that we run on. And I don't think that means that those candidates are bad people, by the way. I think it means that like we use the election to create popular support and a real grassroots movement that made it so that those folks had to pass rent and their leaders knew they had to pass rent and Cuomo knew he had to let them pass rent. And so like it created this tone in Albany that was like, if we don't do rent in 2019, like we can't not. Like it was like the way that we ran the election meant that like 2018 was all about getting real estate money out of politics. 2019 was all about delivering on that promise. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that right now with the uprising against police brutality. We're seeing a little bit about that right now in the uprising around cancel rent. You know, I think that like, and around healthcare for everybody, we're seeing that. So I think the lesson of 2018 and 2019 for organizers, for folks on my side, is that like elections are opportunities to talk to millions of people about our ideas. And then it's tremendous to have folks like you who are like, yeah, we want to be the voice for that. We want to be a voice that uplifts communities. And if elected, we're going to be accountable to the things that we said while we were running, because we know that we don't work for the people who paid for our election. Or well, we do because they're not real estate, right? They're not cops. Like that's very, very important. So I think 2018, 2019, the lesson is how we were able to leverage the electoral cycle to mean something real and significant for our communities and for legislative wins. And it's not easy. But what we did win, just to recap it super quick, is that we were able to expand tenant protections to cover the whole entire state of New York. We were able to eliminate deregulation of rent stabilized apartments, and we are able to make it harder than ever before for your landlord to evict you. So that's a generational victory. Folks have been fighting for that for 20 years. And so I'm really still in awe that we were able to make it happen. And I think part of it is that we really did drive real estate out of political favor. But they are back. They are back and fighting, and they are fighting to protect incumbents in the state assembly. And that is just real, and we need to say that because we were able to make the Senate a more democratic place, but we haven't done that yet in the assembly, and it's important to do that in the assembly. And I'm really happy to support your campaign. And then I guess the last thing I would say about the lessons of 2019 is we still have so far to go. We have to invest in our public housing. And I think that the reason we have to invest in our public housing, and we have to invest in housing our homeless neighbors. And the reason we haven't been able to do that is because Cuomo controls the pocketbooks. So maybe and we have tremendous progressive allies in the state legislature and in the assembly. I should say that there are folks who are really leading the charge, and they need friends up there. And so we're able to pass progressive stuff through the state legislature because I think, we were able to do that. We have not been able to force the governor to spend money. And that's what the housing movement needs to do to move forward.
Good point. Go ahead, Divya.
Yeah, I would just add what New York was able to do in 2018, right? The campaigns that were run in 2018, that has been a model for the rest of the country. So now in 2020, we launched along with the Homes Guarantee campaign, right? We launched the Homes Guarantee Candidate Pledge with JGR signed. She was one of the first, super dope. But like this pledge basically was modeled after 2018. It was like a very specific pledge of like, don't take real estate money. You're going to work with the housing movement. You're going to be accountable to housing organizers in your district. You're going to run on a homes guarantee platform, right? And so we've had like over 100 candidates across the country at all levels of government, from congressional races to city council races to state legislature races, sign that pledge. We even got Bernie Sanders, a presidential candidate, to sign that pledge, right? So that like really shows the growth of the movement, not just in New York, but across the country. And then to just like go back to some of what Sia said, right, about like, we need to do more for public housing. We have to do more on homelessness, right? I think part of that tension has been like, for so long, there have been like different facets of the housing movement that haven't always been coordinated and haven't always been like, under one campaign and actively moving together and trying to like understanding like how, to what extent does a public housing resident understand the concerns of someone who's in private housing and like, other tenants, and like, how do we just build deeper solidarity and understanding across different types of housing in order to build the strength and the power of our movement. So I think that's something we've really invested in over the last year. We've been holding all these teach-ins and facilitating spaces where we're just trying to bring together people from across different types of housing to like share stories, share experiences, be relational with each other, and unite everyone under this one campaign of like, if we really want to fundamentally change the housing system, we need to fight for all of this, right? And that's culminated in the New York Homes Guarantee platform. And that's really, we're not going to win it in like a year or 5 years or maybe even 10, but like it's created this vision that has agitated people in a really helpful way. And it's giving us something of like, okay, this is what comes next, right? And I think that the one thing we have to work on to like truly advance that vision is like, yes, we've elected people. We're getting really good at electing people and getting them to run on our platform. I think we can be a lot better at just co-governing with people and holding them accountable. Because even some of our closest progressive allies don't always do what we need them to do.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I love what you said about, like just having insurgents step up and take that leadership. It changes what's sort of possible in the relationship, but yet we still need deeper relationships and deeper partnerships. And quite frankly, our progressive allies in Albany need more friends. I think someone said they need more friends. And I'm running against someone who's one of those folks who've been appointed by the Queen's machine and is, does what he's told, and that it is no longer the moment for those type of folks, right? It is the moment to truly reflect the diversity and the values of a community, and make sure that there's people who have been on the ground and organizing and understanding the impacts of these policies on their lives to be able to create that change. So obviously I consider myself one of those folks, but there's a whole swath of exciting insurgents who have, young people, organizers, queer people, people of color, women who have stepped up and raised their hand to run for office. And what's been really exciting as an insurgent was really building relationships across many of the insurgents in New York City. So ideally, if we all win, there'll be more, again, strength in numbers. And we could join those who have, stepped out on these issues and have been bold and courageous, but, they need friends, right, to do that. And they need partners like you all. So I really love that framework. So let's talk about, okay, so we had a really exciting 2019. Exciting things happened, not everything. 2020, so we started talking about it, right? Like we were hopeful, there was organizing, we got a bus from Staten Island with people from 5 different cultures speaking 5 different languages. Where are we now? We're in a pandemic in which I have to say housing and food insecurity have been the top issues we've been hearing. As I mentioned, we've been calling folks every single night since like March 14th or 15th, and people are worried about paying the rent. People worried about paying the mortgage, and they're worried about putting food on the table. And that's heartbreaking in a moment and in a country that is like one of the richest countries in the world. So let's talk about the fights that we're having now. The bill that was passed, was it good? Was it bad? I know the answer, but I want you guys to talk about it. And what's next? Like, what's at stake? So it's a lot of questions. Sia, do you want to start?
Sure. All right. So last week, the legislature passed an extremely limited bill that would help. It would create a process for the state to spend $100 million to support landlords whose renters who meet certain characteristics get resources to pay for their costs to run their buildings, and in exchange, they can't evict their renters. So it's like the way that I described it is sort of intentional, right? Like I want folks to understand like the immense bureaucracy that this bill creates, and the hoops that someone who maybe qualifies might have to jump through to get this basic protection against eviction. And the reason why I think this bill is so damaging is because one, the onus that it puts on the renters to apply to like basically have to like go to like maybe 2 or 3 state agencies to ask for like their basic dignity to not be evicted in a pandemic. 2, it's extremely restrictive in who's even eligible to apply. So we have no assurance that those of us who work in the gig economy or our undocumented neighbors will even be able to access the resources. And 3, they are asking us to still, under this legislation where the state is paying our landlord for some of our rent, to pay 50 or 60% of our incomes in rent. So that is the state both condoning and codifying immensely unsustainable rent burdens, which means we are going to be, as a state of New York, subsidizing our landlords to keep people in homes that they cannot afford, and those folks will be evicted anyway. So we are paying our landlords to evict us in this bill. And we're spending $100 million to do it. So, you know, a lot of folks in the state legislature said, like, we know this bill sucks. Like, we know this bill is insufficient. You know, that was the refrain. Like, I hate this bill, but if it helps one person, that makes me feel better. And I need to do that. And, you know, it's a step forward. We know it's not enough, and we're going to come back and do more. And I hear that, and I respect it, and I love that. And I know that they're trying to do the best that they can. But I also think that, you know, if I wanted to go on, let's say I wanted to go on like a 5-mile walk or a hike or some shit. Sorry to swear. The first thing that I would do is not like break my ankle and then say it's a step forward, right? Like, I really think what we just did with this piece of legislation is set up a framework that's going to make it that much harder for the activists and the tenants and our homeless neighbors in our communities to like fight for a new framework, right? Because now we're bought into this framework. Now federal money is going to come in, and the first thing they're going to do is like, well, we have this, why would we create something new? And I'm like, well, that thing sucks. And then the final thing that I just want to say is that like, it does nothing for our homeless neighbors. There is no path in the state legislature right now to end homelessness in our state. And in the richest state, in the richest country in the world, where 114 billionaires live and pay taxes, where 114 billionaires own probably 3 or 4 homes, it's completely unconscionable that we cannot find a way to get people into housing, period. And that's how I see it. And so like, I don't think that this bill was a step forward. I think it was a step backward. I agree with my friends in the state legislature who said it was insufficient, but I also think it's almost worse than insufficient. And I really, really urge them to go back to work and to create a framework that makes sense for our renters. They really just have to.
Yeah, I think Sia captured it and like used analogies to perfection. It's a broken ankle. The only thing I would add is that like it's precedented by a really bad budget, right? Like it's precedented by this really awful austerity budget that just slashes and like also opens the door to slash even more as we try to weather this crisis. And, you know, I think we're thinking a lot right now, again, like in this current moment, people are calling to defund the NYPD, right? We're thinking about how is money allocated by our government and to what and to whom, right? There's so much money that's like driven towards policing and the militarization of our people, and that should just be going to like actually supporting people, right? That's not actual public safety. It's not community safety, right? To actually keep people safe, spend the money on keeping them in their homes or getting them homes when they don't have them to begin with, right? So I think like another thing we're thinking of as a movement is just like the divest, invest framework. And also just like, we got to tax the rich to pay for this shit.
100%, right? Like, it's just an abdication of responsibility. We have to be willing to stand up to Cuomo and tax the rich. That's a fundamental one.
Yeah, and I think what I'm extremely frustrated with is the lack of courage to take that step, because there's a revenue base that is there. Like, it's not like we have no revenue. Like, it's not like there's no possibility of funds. Like it's there. Like, we just need to do it, and it literally would not even harm their pocket. Like, it's just digging a little deeper. And what is 114 billionaires? I have a stat here. I think they would bring in, if we just tax them, forget about the millionaires, ultra millionaires, we just tax them, we bring in $5.5 billion.
Yeah.
And maybe even more. So it's just, as you said, it's unconscionable that in this crisis where we're seeing people not have a roof over their head, or living in fear of being evicted, even though we have protections or moratorium, it doesn't hold, right? Like, people are just going to get evicted when this is over. That we just haven't asked those who have the most and who have benefited from this city and state and all the resources that we provide, to bring in the money that we need to support our infrastructure. So yeah. I'm with you. It's actually an easy solution. It sounds like ridiculously easy, but it is, and there's really good advocates that are fighting and demanding it. But there's not enough. And again, the pressure needs to put on the governor to do that.
We need to take away some of Cuomo's power, and then I also I would be remiss to not say that the congressional delegation needs to bring home some money too, you know? And we have this unfortunate dynamic where it's like Cuomo v. Trump. Like, that's the national narrative, right? Where Cuomo gets to go on CNN with his brother and say, I'm like the crisis hero. I was going to say crisis daddy, but then I got embarrassed. I'm the crisis daddy. And then there's Trump over here who's failing people, right? But actually both Cuomo and Trump are failing us. And we just need to break out of that framework where it's Cuomo versus Trump, tax rich people in New York State, and bring home money from the federal government to keep our state running.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Divya, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it all comes back to electoral politics too, right? Like, this whole vote blue no matter who, that's not going to fly. That's not going to cut it. And I think we're seeing that with our congressional delegation, right? Like, we see it with Cuomo. Like, being a Democrat, being a progressive, it just doesn't mean much at this point. I'm just so overcome by my frustration with this, how so many people are claiming the progressive mantle without living up to the values and demands of the movement. And it's just fucking frustrating. Sorry.
No,
Yeah.
Totally. I saw a stat. It was on Twitter. So I shouldn't trust things on Twitter, but it's every state where there's been these instances of aggressive police brutality are states with blue state houses and blue governors. And there is just and blue mayors in the blue big cities. And there's just this reality about, there's a fight. We've been observing this for many years. There's a fight for who's controlling the Democratic Party, and it's going to keep playing out. And, we're in it right now.
What I was saying was I was so caught up in our conversation that I realized we only have a few more minutes left. Just a reminder, if you have a question, you could type it in the chat. And I'm having folks check the Facebook page. So if anyone has, okay, so we don't have any questions yet. But I do want to ask, like, we just have about 5 more minutes left. What's next? Like, what, I mean, again, we're in this pandemic. There's a housing crisis that has unfolded. I wouldn't say we're on the precipice, like it's there. What's next? What are advocates doing? What are the conversations? This terrible bill passed. Like you said, it's a bad framework and one in which then gets reinvested in. How do we move forward in a way that's brings us more towards the vision that we want in the world?
Totally. So the most important thing for the next 3 weeks, again, I am here as a citizen and not as a staffer, is that people we need to vote. Like we need to like volunteer for progressive candidates and win some of these races in the state assembly, and that's going to transform what happens. So if you are watching this and you can, I would really urge you to volunteer for Jessica. I would urge you to volunteer for some of the other insurgent candidates. If you can't volunteer, throw a couple bucks. Like, it's really going to make a difference in this moment, because we really, it's weird to be running an election in this. It's weird to run an election in this moment. I don't even know what to say, but it doesn't mean it's not important. So I think for the next 3 weeks, we need to focus on that. And then after that, we need to sort of like reset. Like, we need to say, like, you know, we are in a depression now. We are in a moment where many, many people have lost a tremendous amount of faith in our government because of what's happening with the police. And so we have to rebuild that faith, and the way that we do that is by investing and like divesting from like state violence and investing in housing and investing in education. And so, you know, I think we need to get through the next 3 weeks, but then we need to like reset everybody's relationship with their government, and the only way to do that is by spending money on good things like housing and schools and the trains, and like taking money out of things like guns and like surveillance technology and the stuff that's really harming our communities.
Yeah, I think all of that. I definitely second the call to volunteer and donate to Jessica and other insurgent candidates. Super, super important. I put some of my stimulus check towards that. I don't know if that's allowed, right? But I think just from an organizing perspective too, I think something that the movement has kind of meditated on is the fact that we've built a lot of narrative power over the last couple of years, right? Like a year ago, no one knew what a homes guarantee was, right? It was just like a phrase. And now, you know, it's something very powerful. It is a vision for how housing should look like, how we decommodify housing. And people are starting to like see housing as something that's sexy again. Like, we've been pushing it in presidential debates, right? We've been pushing more and more candidates to talk about it and tell us, like, how are you going to support us and build our housing vision? And I think that narrative power is so important, and that's been accompanied by like really, really important political education at all levels to really push us towards that vision. But the narrative power is just one facet of power. And I think we're also thinking about how we just build our strength as a coalition, as organizations, is how do we bring more and more people into the movement? And that's been happening during this pandemic, right? Because people can't pay rent, so many more people are paying attention to this than they ever have before. We've seen that. We have like 100,000 person email list now because people are paying attention, right? You've seen that in the rent strikes, right? On May 1st, there were 190,000 buildings on rent strike across the country. I was looking at the westriketogether.org, the website that's tracking all the rent strikes today. And now that number is at like 600,000, over 600,000, which is insane, right? Like, the movement is building. So now it's just like, how do we turn that into something sustainable? How do we keep people paying attention after this crisis is over? Because the housing crisis existed before coronavirus, exacerbated by this pandemic, and it's just going to be even worse afterwards. So the more people we can bring into the movement, like, the more power we can build.
I love it. So just to close, can you share how people can learn about your day job, not what you're here representing, but share, you know, a website or a resource or ways people can get involved in this movement.
Totally. You should visit housingjusticeforall.org. And there's like a lot of resources, both like about your rights as a renter in this weird moment where our courts are semi-closed. And you can also get connected with us there. You can get connected through us, and we will like direct you to a local community organization that's organizing where you live. Because we want to be that vector. We want to connect people to their organizing group.
Yeah. And there's some good ones in our community and in our district. Woodside on the Move is one of the first. And actually,
when we Make the Road, they're amazing.
Yeah, Make the Road, exactly. How about you, Divya?
Yeah, you can go to cvhaction.org and learn about what I do in my day job. And then I would also just encourage you, so one of our partners is People's Action. They're the ones who house the Homes Guarantee campaign. They're going to do a training tomorrow night on the connection between policing and private property. And we had like a preview of that as a coalition. It was a really, really good training. So definitely check that out. If you go to homesguarantee.com/Thursdays, you can find that training.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. I'm really grateful for your work, your leadership, your voices, and the solutions that you're bringing to the table in terms of housing justice. And like I said earlier, I can't wait to partner with you all. I think, Sia, you said co-govern. I love that word because as an elected official, right, you are a public servant who is supposed to reflect the needs and the voices and the solutions of the community. And you all have been working deeply in our community and in communities across the city and state. So I'm super excited to be in sisterhood with you all and to fight for housing justice as it relates also to all the other social justice issues that we are fighting for, because again, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle. So I want to thank you both so much. Again, the resources are in the chat box. Hopefully you can download it real quick before we say goodbye, but thank you both for your time. Next week, next Wednesday, we're talking about education justice, and we're gonna have folks who their day job is at Alliance for Quality Education. I think they're actually okay to join us as someone informing us of their work. So we're gonna tackle that topic. And this Sunday, we're gonna encourage folks to join the virtual Queen's Pride, because sadly Queen's Pride is not happening, obviously for obvious reasons, but we want folks to be able to participate virtually. So thank you, Divya, thank you, Sia, and thank you everyone for joining, and have a wonderful night. Okay. Bye everyone.